Enjoy with your headphones for a better listening experience.
Please watch till the end of the video to have the most scariest part of the story.
What is the most horrific disaster? No one has ever heard of it. The Kansas City Hyatt Skywalk collapse, which I had never heard of until the podcast Swindle did an episode on it. It was a big open dance party in the lobby of a hotel with thousands in attendance, and the new skywalk completely gave out. The whole scene sounds horrific: amputations on site with kitchen knives and chainsaws, flooding threatening drowning and electrocution during the rescue operations, just nuts. Engineering on the skywalks was ineptitude mixed with dreaming. The most horrific racing crash was at Le Mans in 1955. 84 dead, 120 injured when Pierre Lavage's Mercedes careened into the crowd next to the track across from the uncontrolled pits. The race continued, largely due to the traffic jam that would be caused by red flagging it. Mercedes withdrew and didn't return to racing for over 30 years. The Aberfan disaster, which buried a primary school full of children and teachers in coal slurry. The Aberfan disaster was the catastrophic collapse of a colliery spoil tip on October 21, 1966. The tip had been created on a mountain slope above the Welsh village of Aberfan, near Merthyr Tydfil, and overlaid a natural spring. Heavy rain led to a buildup of water within the tip, which caused it to suddenly slide downhill as a slurry, killing 116 children and 28 adults as it engulfed Panatella's junior school and a row of houses. The trip was the responsibility of the National Coal Board, NCB, and the subsequent inquiry placed the blame for the disaster on the organization and 9 named employees. The Johnstown flood, which was caused by some of the most powerful men in U.S. at the time and their South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Henry Clay Frick led a group of Pittsburgh speculators, including Benjamin Ruff, to purchase the abandoned reservoir, modify it, and convert it into a private resort lake for their wealthy associates. Many were connected through business and social links to Carnegie Steel. Development included lowering the dam to make its top wide enough to hold a road and putting a fish screen in the spillway. Workers lowered the dam, which had been 72 feet 22 meters high, by 3 feet 0.91 m. 10. These alterations are thought to have increased the vulnerability of the dam. Moreover, a system of relief pipes and valves, a feature of the original dam which had previously been sold off for scrap, was not replaced, so the club had no way of lowering the water level in the lake in case of an emergency. After multiple days of rainfall, the dam breached and flooded multiple towns and killing 2,209 people, making the disaster the largest loss of civilian life in the U.S. at the time. The 1975 Banqiao Dam failure, poor engineering, poor construction, and a typhoon resulted in the Banqiao Dam and 61 others downstream collapsing. It flooded 30 cities, affected 10 million people, and killed between 26,000 and 240,000. The Chinese government hid the incident, and it was completely unknown in the West until the 90s. They only declassified it in 2005. The Beverly Hills Supper Club fire in 1977 in northern Kentucky. 165 people were killed. It helped usher in new fire codes and regulations. Issues involved no sprinkler system, no smoke detectors, no emergency lighting, exit doors blocked, overcrowding, flammable fabrics, and no notification system. I was incredibly young, but I do remember hearing about it on the news. Another just up the road about 5 miles in Cincinnati was the Who concert in 1979. 11 people were crushed to death storming the Doors. It impacted / banned general admission concerts in the region for years. Gasoline explosions in the sewer system in Guadalajara, Jalisco, April 22, 1992. National Geographic did a show on it, and it was absolutely odd reporting. Mexican Petroleums or Pemex dumped thousands of gallons in the sewer system trying to cover accounting fraud. Government officially reported 400 dead. I was a rescue worker and investigative reporter. We counted at least 11,000 dead. I hate corruption. The station nightclub fire in 2003. Great White was playing. There was pyro and it caught the acoustic foam ceiling on fire. 100 people died and almost 300 injured. The guy with the band who lit the pyro went to prison. The foam stuff was not up to code, but they hadn't been fined or anything when they had been inspected. It was an avoidable disaster. The Inglanderungluk, English misfortune, on the Sjøensland mountain in the Black Forest in 1936. An English schoolteacher took a group of 27 pupils aged 12 to 17 up a mountain despite warnings of an incoming storm. They got lost and had to be rescued by locals, but 5 pupils died. The rescue efforts and hospitality of the local Hitler youth were vaunted as propaganda by the Nazi government. I only learned about this when I moved to the city of Freiburg, which the mountain overlooks, a few years ago. There's a small monument up there still. Boston molasses disaster of 1919. 12,000 metric tons of molasses flooded the streets after a storage tank exploded. It only had around 20 recorded deaths, but the death count isn't a scary part. You know how sticky and slow molasses are? Can you imagine getting stuck in it, and how hard it would be to rescue someone without getting trapped yourself? Some of the victims who drowned or died were covered in it, so it was hard to identify the bodies. Not to mention that the smell lingered for years afterwards. I initially read the question as disease, so people in the modern developed world have no idea how horrifying cholera outbreaks are. Cholera is a disease spread through the fecal-oral route. Bacteria from someone's poop gets into your gut, most often because a water source is contaminated. Once the bacteria reach your intestine, as quickly as 12 hours after exposure, the diarrhea starts. You may vomit, too, but you're going to have horrible diarrhea. How horrible. Gallons. Up to 5 gallons of diarrhea a day. The bacteria essentially jam on the eject button in your bowels. Someone with cholera pretty rapidly runs out of feces, but they will continue to squirt out watery, grayish diarrhea. Some modern strains are so nasty that you die of dehydration within hours of symptoms starting. You can be perfectly healthy, and then literally hit yourself to death within hours. Today cholera is easy to treat. All it takes is medical monitoring, clean water, and some salt and sugar. But cholera doesn't happen in places where there's clean water. It happens in places like Haiti after the 2010 earthquake, where over 4,000 people died within months of an earthquake. In 1854, a cholera outbreak in London gave rise to modern epidemiology, and also killed 127 people in one neighborhood in 3 days. That's people who were healthy, and within 3 days, got sick and died. Any cholera outbreak is by definition horrible. I only recently learned about the Andes plane crash in the 1970s. I don't want to look up the story right now to avoid ruining my currently good mood, but from my memory, the plane crashed in the cold mountains in South America and the victims resorted to cannibalism to survive as long as they did. They ate the dead victims' bodies. The survivors were stuck on the mountains for 2 months or so before being found. Even sadder was that once they were rescued, their societies heavily criticized them for cannibalism. Like, why all the criticism? It's so easy to judge them when you're not the one fighting for your life against injuries from the crash, extremely wintry weather, and starvation. Incredibly sad for the victims that died and the survivors who had to make those tough choices and face judgment. The WHO concert in Cincinnati, Ohio in 1979 where 11 people died and others injured from getting crushed by the crowd surge or falling and being trampled to death. There were no assigned seats, so when some of the glass doors holding the crowd back were broken, people rushed in to get the best seats. The show went on as scheduled as this happened in the hallway outside the main arena and the injured and dead people were just taken away from the building. The sinking of the USS Indianapolis in 1944 by a Japanese torpedo in the Pacific Ocean. Out of a total of nearly 1,200 crew members, only 300 survivors were found adrift in the middle of the ocean. 300 immediately went down with the vessel. The remaining loss of life was attributed to causes like dehydration, exposure, saltwater poisoning, and, most terrifying of them all, shark attacks. Yes, you heard right, it wasn't uncommon for sharks to pluck off any survivors one by one and eat them alive. Sharks also ate the corpses of those who succumbed to the elements. It took weeks for anyone to notice that the USS Indianapolis had sunken before efforts were made to rescue any survivors. Survivors also recalled that the blast from the torpedo was so massive that they were given no time to leave the project as the vessel sunk within minutes of impact. The Weinkauf Hotel fire in Atlanta, Georgia on December 7, 1946, was the deadliest hotel fire in American history, killing 119 hotel occupants. The famous Pulitzer Prize-winning photo of the women jumping from the hotel window was sadly taken that night. Fire escape regulations were enacted as a result of this disaster. The Iroquois Theater fire is the deadliest single-building fire in U.S. history, and it's the basis for many fire codes for public venues we have today. Nearly 700 people died, but we don't actually know the exact number. Most people died trying to escape but couldn't be due to poorly designed exits. Almost the entire situation went wrong after the fire code was ignored. It and the station nightclub fire are the two things I keep most in my mind as a theater manager when people get upset at me for enforcing fire codes. What jumped to my mind is the case of the Radium Girls. The number of victims isn't nearly as high as the other cases I see mentioned here, and it didn't happen at one time, but over time. Still, the notion that young women were paid a pittance to use radium to paint watch dials and were told the material wasn't dangerous and they should use their lips to sharpen the brush. The results were gruesome. And the victims that did die didn't die quickly. It was painful and prolonged. And then that thought brought to mind the Tuskegee syphilis study that absolutely tortured hundreds of black men unbeknownst to them, over decades and for no real purpose in the end, since it was continued after funding was revoked. And the cure was never administered to any of the subjects, even after it was discovered, separately, not as a result of this evil. Moscow Theater Hostage Crisis, 2002. 850 people held hostage in a Moscow theater by terrorists. They came up with a plan to flood the place with knockout gas and it actually worked. They got the terrorists. None of the hostages were hurt. Then they dragged the unconscious hostages outside and laid them out on the sidewalk to get medical attention. But it was raining. 172 of them drowned from lying on their backs and rain pooling in their mouths. Coming from Pennsylvania, I know most people outside of PA, really even outside Western PA. Coming from Pennsylvania, I know most people outside of PA, really even outside Western PA, have never heard of the Johnstown flood. It was started basically by the rich folk of the 1880s building a big to have their lake houses on, big names like Carnegie, Mellon, Schwab, you get the idea. A huge rainstorm came and broke, flooding the town. But even worse, or just as bad, as the flood. Tons of oil-covered debris got backed up under bridges and burned super hot, so the town basically flooded and burned at the same time. Nearly 2,000 people died, I believe. I remember hearing something like it was the most people on continental US to die in one day until 9/11. Haven't checked that fact though. Aeroflot Flight 5143. This is the deadliest aviation accident in the Soviet Union, and it happened on July 10, 1985, because the crew has been up for 24 hours and were experiencing extreme fatigue. After the Tupolev Tu-154 took off from Arshi Airport, the aircraft was put on autopilot by the crew and the crew fell asleep. This was an era of autopilot where you set the designated altitude and climb speed and the aircraft would hold that climb speed until it reached the altitude that the pilot had input. The aircraft maintained the attitude even though it was losing speed, which meant the nose kept going up and up until the aircraft entered into a stall. A stall is when airflow over the wings decreased to the point where lift is no longer being created. When the aircraft entered the stall, the crew was shaken awake and they erroneously thought that the shaking was from an engine surge, so they decreased the throttle. However, this was the opposite of what you want to do in a stall. In a stall, you want full throttle and push your nose over to regain airspeed. Since the crew decreased the throttle, the stall only got worse until the aircraft entered into a flat spin. A flat spin is literally where the aircraft spins along its vertical axis and the nose and wings are straight. It is virtually impossible to recover from a flat spin. As a result, Flight 5143 crashed in Chuck, killing all 200 people that were on board the flight. Eastern Airlines Flight 401, December 29, 1972. Essentially, the crew was distracted by a burnt-out light bulb regarding the landing gear. They didn't notice they accidentally disconnected the autopilot and slowly descended into the Everglades, crashing and killing 101 out of 176 people. What gets more interesting is that the aircraft was a write-off, scrapped, but Eastern used parts of it on their other aircraft. Flight attendants, pilots, and passengers reported seeing the ghost of dead crew members and passengers on the aircrafts that received parts from Flight 401. Limnic eruptions. Probably only happened twice in history, but one event led to over 1,000 deaths. Basically, certain lakes have layers that don't mix. If they're extremely deep, carbon dioxide can get trapped and build up in the lower layers. Some kind of catalyst happens, exact causes are unknown, and the lake releases all the CO2 at once, basically causing it to explode and create a tsunami from a lake. That would be crazy enough, but the released CO2 was also enough to suffocate people and livestock nearby. 1,700 people died of suffocation in 1986 due to a limnic eruption from Lake Meows. It's classified as a unique, extremely rare type of natural disaster, and it blew my mind when I learned about it because I've never heard of anything like it. Just when I thought I was starting to have the Earth figured out, a lake spontaneously exploded and suffocated an entire nearby village. As an Albertan, I have two from Alberta that I feel like aren't really well known on the world stage. The Frank Slide of 1903, 110 million tons of limestone rock slid down the side of Turtle Mountain and towards the town of Frank. About 70 to 90 people died. It is one of the largest landslides in Canada and is the deadliest. I've driven through that area multiple times and the size of some of the boulders and how far it reaches is amazing. The flooding of 2013, between June 19 and July 12, 2013. Multiple rivers in Alberta flooded due to heavy rainfall and snowpack melt from the mountains. There was about $5 billion in property damage and 5 people died. It affected many communities all around Alberta. The Farmerville mine explosion in Tennessee in 1902, the worst mining disaster in Tennessee history. The official death toll was 216, though locals said the number was probably higher due to unregistered miners and unidentified bodies. Many families lost all of their adult men, and that includes what would now be considered teenage boys. My great-grandmother lost her first husband and eventually remarried the man who would become my great-grandfather. Perhaps ironically, it was considered one of the better mines in which to work in Tennessee, fair pay not in scrip, safer, and never used convict labor. Some of the miners survived the initial blast but were trapped. They realized they were unlikely to survive, and wrote letters to their loved ones, in some cases having the literate miners write for them. The article includes some, and they are heartbreaking. If you look at the cemetery picture in the Wikipedia article, my grandparents are buried there. My grandmother was one of 2 children my great-grandparents had, and my grandfather wanted them both buried with her people. The Goiânia radioactive accident. In the city of Goiânia, Brazil, a man who worked with scrap metal found an abandoned X-ray machine. He didn't know what it was, and dismantled the machine, exposing the cesium-137 core. The incident is much sadder than it may sound at first glance. He found the glow of the cesium-137 beautiful and took it home to show it to his daughters. They died from radiation exposure, as did other people, and part of the city became contaminated. The Galveston hurricane of 1900. 600 to 800 dead. The Weather Service was just getting started and there was nothing known of the science behind hurricanes. The weather guy in Galveston figured out a lot and saw it coming, but his bosses in D.C. wouldn't listen to him. He survived and later moved up in the organization and started research on hurricanes. The Boston Molasses Disaster, aka the Great Molasses Flood or Boston Massacre. In 1919 a large storage tank filled with 2.3 million gallons of molasses burst, and the 25-foot-tall wave of molasses rushed through the streets at 35 miles per hour. After the initial wave, the molasses became viscous out in the cold, trapping those caught in the wave, killing 21 people, and injuring 150. The area still smells of molasses on sizzling summer days. The Cinema Rex fire. On August 19, 1978 in a movie theater known as Cinema Rex in Abadan, Iran, a massive fire broke out killing between 377 to 470 people and later on it was discovered that it was an intentional arson attack that was found to be most consistent with attacks carried out by fundamentalist militants and until the 1990 massacre of Sri Lankan police officers was considered the deadliest single act of terrorism in human history although, the Sri Lankan massacre would be surpassed 11 years later by September 11. The Bhopal Union Carbide disaster in India, per wiki 500,000 people exposed to cyanide poisoning, and 200 or so dead with little to no compensation. The Bhopal disaster or Bhopal gas tragedy was a chemical accident on the night of 2 to 3 December 1984 at the Union Carbide India Limited, UCIL, pesticide plant in Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh, India. Considered the world's worst industrial disaster, over 500,000 people in the small towns around the plant were exposed to the highly toxic gas methyl isocyanate, MIC. Estimates vary on the death toll, with the official number of immediate deaths being 2,259. In 2008, the government of Madhya Pradesh paid compensation to the family members of 3,787 victims killed in the gas release, and to 574,366 injured victims. Shortly after the Titanic went down, the U.S. mandated there be enough life rafts for every passenger on U.S. boats. In order to comply, some boats added more weight to the top of the boats than they were designed to hold. One steamboat, still moored in the river in Chicago that they dye green every St. Patrick's Day, had over 2,000 people on board when it decided to roll over. 844 passengers drowned within 20 feet of shore. Never knew a thing about it until I saw a small plaque commemorating the Eastland disaster as I walked by. Bhopal. I know that it's not the case that no one has heard of it, but when this happened and most people around me in the US either said oh well or actually didn't know about it, and when the company was just allowed to change its name and carry right on. I was a kid when this happened, and I cried so hard that I threw up. The people around me, even my loving mother who taught me right from wrong, they were concerned. They weren't concerned about the fact that we were all singing along to the corporate jingles on our televisions or buying useless products that killed us just like they killed that city, only a little slower. They were concerned because I was so upset about a bunch of people across the world who I had no connection with and who I couldn't do anything about. Was it indicative of some kind of mental health problem if the deaths of a city full of strangers upset me to this degree? At least Bhopal prepared me somewhat for Sandy Hook. We didn't do anything then, either. Everyone has forgotten about the St. Francis Dam disaster in California. When it broke it washed away millions of acres of fertile land and due to the flood the estimated death toll was around 700. And many towns were just completely wiped off the map. There is still one piece of the dam at the site you can visit that has been turned into a memorial of sorts. On December 9, 2019, Wakari/White Island, an active stratovolcano island in New Zealand's northeastern Bay of Plenty region, explosively erupted. The island was a popular tourist destination, known for its volcanic activity, and 47 people were on the island at the time. 22 people died, either in the explosion or from injuries sustained, including 2 whose bodies were never found and were later declared dead. A further 25 people suffered injuries, with the majority needing intensive care for severe burns. I have a couple pics. The Bhopal disaster. A pesticide manufacturing plant in Bhopal, India leaked a toxic gas in the middle of the night and killed up to 16,000 people. The sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff by the Allies at the end of the Second World War. It was evacuating civilians at the time of its sinking and went down with close to 10,000 souls. The Lake Mose disaster. Lake Mose is on the East African Rift and had become supersaturated with carbon dioxide from volcanic outgassing. Something disturbed the lake, believed to be a landslide, and the gas came out of solution. Since CO2 was heavier than air, it blanked low-lying areas, and asphyxiated villagers in their sleep. And CO2 asphyxia is a painful, horrific way to go. Nearly 2,000 dead. The Italian Hull disaster, or the massacre of 1913, in which 73 men, women, and children from the families of striking Union copper miners were trampled to death during a Christmas celebration when someone reportedly yelled fire, in Calumet, Michigan, Italian Hull disaster. The vast majority of those killed were children, 59 total out of the 73. Most were immigrants of Finnish descent, who had come here to work in the mines under horrid conditions. There was no fire. Peshtigo, Wisconsin fire. It happened on the same day as the Great Chicago Fire in 1871. 1,500 plus dead, billions of old-growth trees destroyed. Devastated something like 1.5 million acres in the Green Bay area. Some of the scariest fire behavior that I've ever heard about. I used to be a wildland firefighter for 7 seasons, and I'd never heard of anyone encountering one of several forms of fire behavior, let alone all of them. The station nightclub fire. Pyrotechnics were used in a nightclub lined with very flammable insulation foam. This resulted in a fire that had completely overtaken the nightclub within about 6 minutes, and a death toll of 100 people, 230 others were injured. The thing that made this disaster so deadly was the ensuing crowd crush made it near impossible for people to get out. People died being crushed in the doorframe. IIRC, people were being turned away from one of the exits because it was a staff-only area, which only worsened the crowd crush at the main entrance. There is footage from the fire by a reporter who was inside the building. It's pretty easy to find if you Google it, but I will warn that it is quite disturbing. The Bond Dance Hall explosion happened in West Plains, Missouri on Friday the 13th, 1928. The cause of the explosion is still unknown, but it is pretty widely accepted that it was caused by a gasoline explosion from the auto shop beneath the dance hall. Approximately 37 people were killed that night, and 20 others were injured. Of the 19 people who escaped the explosion, only 3 were women. This was because the men were stronger and able to climb out of the wreckage, but meant they left their dates trapped in the rubble. When the many bodies were found, most were unrecognizable. 5 coffins were used for all of the body parts recovered from the wreckage. Horrific way to go. The 1986 Lake Mose disaster probably wasn't the most horrific, but the most unusual and bizarre cause. Essentially, a buildup of carbon dioxide dissolved deep in the lake water reached the point where the lake burped and the CO2 came out of solution, and since carbon dioxide is heavier than air, the estimated 100,000 to 1,600,000 tons of the gas settled onto nearby villages, displaced the air, and suffocated 1,746 people and 3,500 head of livestock. The San Bernardino train disaster in 1989. It wasn't so much a huge loss of life, but just the way it played out. Total cascade of preventable errors led to a 6-locomotive train coming down the Cajon Pass with no brakes, said to have hit a 40 miles per hour curve at 110 plus and derailed, totally wiping out some houses on Duffy's Sig. 2 weeks later, during the cleanup process, a gasoline pipeline is damaged. The failure results in gasoline being misted into the air and eventually finding a spark, igniting a fireball, which burned for 7 more hours, destroying another 10 plus houses. It literally sounds like a Michael Bay movie. The final stadium disaster may have killed put to 20,000 people, although those figures are likely exaggerated. For a time gladiatorial games were banned, and people rushed out to see them when they were put on again. Some wooden stadium seats were overtaxed. The response was shockingly modern. The Emperor Tiberius rushed to the city to help and passed laws about sponsors of gladiatorial games needing to have a certain amount of money and mandating inspections of stands. The Beslan school siege, where 313 hostages were killed in a failed storming of a building. Alternatively, there is JAL 123, which killed 520 people when the vertical stab and hydraulics were sheared off due to an improper repair on the bulkhead. Or Nigerian 2120, which saw 261 fatalities due to an underinflated tire. There is also the shampooing store collapse because they fired the engineering and construction firm originally used, as well as the Taegu subway disaster from arson, though it's second to the Baku metro fire. The most interesting I think is the Salong Tunnel accident, which is likely the deadliest vehicle accident in history. The Lexington steamship disaster, an early steamship run by Cornelius Vanderbilt, caught fire during a trip from Manhattan to Stonington, Connecticut, killing approximately 139 people, only 4 survived. I had never heard of it until I did some family history research and discovered my 3 ex-great-grandfather died in this disaster. This disaster is one of the early lithographs that made lithographers Currier and Ives famous. The Hamlet chicken plant fire in Hamlet, North Carolina 1991. Employees of a chicken processing plant were locked in by the plant owner who accused them of stealing, so when a fire broke out due to shoddy electrical maintenance, the employees were trapped and 25 perished. It resulted in a lot of new labor safety laws in NC, but the plant owner faced minimal consequence, sentenced to 19 years in prison but was let out on parole less than 4 years into his sentence, and a fine on the company that never got paid because the company declared bankruptcy. Jello Biafra wrote an excellent song about it, which is how I learned about it, and I've lived in NC my whole life. The Exterminate Sparrows/4 Pests campaign in China to eliminate a common crop pest, the Eurasian tree sparrow. Authorities had citizens continuously create loud noise and disturbance to keep the birds airborne until they died of exhaustion or simply shot them from the sky in an organized campaign to drive them to extinction. Millions of birds were killed. It resulted in an ecological collapse, with locusts and insect populations exploding and destroying crops, and ultimately causing the Great Chinese Famine from 1959 to 1961. The famine killed a likely 50 million plus people and is considered one of the worst manufactured disasters in human history. Some provinces lost 15% or more of their population. There were a few other factors, but the sparrow collapse and subsequent insect explosion is the primary cause. Maybe it's discussed more in China, but I only heard of it in my ornithology classes, and it seems scarcely mentioned in Western culture for the mass devastation it caused. Was always scary to me as it shows the severe consequences humanity faces when we look around with the natural balance of the ecosystem. Climate change and species extinction poses a scary future to humans. In 1938, the Chinese National Army intentionally destroyed the system of dikes and levees holding back the Yellow River in an attempt to halt or at least delay the advance of the Imperial Japanese Army. Estimates for immediate civilian casualties range from 30,000 to 80,000, and the resulting disease and famine potentially caused another 400,000 to 500,000 civilian deaths. Bhopal gas tragedy. On December 3, 1984, about 45 tons of the dangerous gas methyl isocyanate escaped from an insecticide plant that was owned by the Indian subsidiary of the American firm Union Carbide Corporation. The gas drifted over the densely populated neighborhoods around the plant, killing thousands of people immediately and creating a panic as tens of thousands of others attempted to flee Bhopal. The final death toll was estimated to be between 15,000 and 20,000. Some halves a million survivors suffered respiratory problems, eye irritation or blindness, and other maladies resulting from exposure to the toxic gas. Many were awarded compensation of a few $100s. The Italian hall fire in Calumet, Michigan, Christmas Eve, 1913. Striking workers had been off work for months and a Christmas party was held for the children of striking workers. There was one entrance/exit at the bottom of a steep staircase. Someone, a strike buster, yelled fire and the whole room tried to flee the building via the stairway. They were unable to open the door at the bottom of the stairs and 73 people, 59 of which were children, were crushed in the mayhem. There was no fire. Funerals were held on Christmas Day. The Wellington Avalanches. Wellington, WA. At Stevens Pass, 2 trains Snowden parked on the tracks were hit by an avalanche and swept down into the ravine below. Deadliest avalanche in U.S. history, 96 dead. Read The White Cascade by Gary Christ or Vis Major by Martin Bowash. The site still exists as a memorial with downed trees and parts of the trains still there. The winter of 536 AD. The volcanic eruptions caused crop failures, and were accompanied by the plague of Justinian, famine, and millions of deaths and initiated the late antique Little Ice Age, which lasted from 536 to 560. The medieval scholar Michael McCormick wrote that 536 was the beginning of one of the worst periods to be alive, if not the worst year. It's hard to say that no one has ever heard of the Striga slide, because clearly there's a wiki page. And tons of YouTube material. The Striga slide was such a seismic event that it literally changed the geographic map of Europe, isolated the British Isles from the European continent, and killed maybe up to half of the entire human population of prehistoric Britain. If it happened today, all of the major urban populations in Scotland and eastern England would be wiped out.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.